We are the paradoxical ape. Bipedal, naked, large-brained, long the master of fire, tools, and language, but still trying to understand ourselves. Aware that death is inevitable, yet filled with optimism. We grow up slowly. We hand down knowledge. We empathize and deceive. We shape the future from our shared understanding of the past. CARTA brings together experts from diverse disciplines to exchange insights on who we are and how we got here. An exploration made possible by the generosity of humans like you.
Okay, well, it's a great honor to be here, and I thank the organizers, Nick and Ajit, for inviting me, and also all of you for coming. So I would like to start by showing you a video clip of something that we filmed last summer in Gorongosa National Park in Mozambique. So Gorongosa is an amazing biodiversity hotspot, and we have here what looks like a fairly kind of peaceful scene. So we have a troop of baboons resting and feeding. We've got some warthogs walking around. We've got some waterbuck grazing and so on. So it's all quite idyllic. But, of course, nature's rarely idyllic. And if you look more closely, you can see that this guy here in the middle is quite busy doing something. And then if we zoom in, which we will in a second, we'll see that he has hunted and is now eating a young antelope, a reedbuck. But unlike a lion with a killer bite, this baboon is eating the antelope while it's still alive, which you could argue is not particularly sensible, given that it means that the antelope still has a chance to escape, which, as you'll see in a second, it's still very much trying to do at this point. So for us, I think this really is quite a sort of gruesome scene, but at the same time, it does raise some very interesting questions that we can ask about what might be going on in that baboon's head. And some of those questions actually hark back to what Nick was talking about in his introduction. So for example, does this baboon know that the antelope is still alive? Does the baboon know that the fact that the antelope is moving is a sign that it's still alive? Does the baboon know that it can kill the antelope? And does it know what it needs to do to kill the antelope? And that once it has killed it, the antelope will remain dead? Does the baboon know that it itself will die one day, and so will all other baboons and all other antelopes and so on? And then finally, you might have noticed in that video, the antelope's mother standing to one side. So another question could be, I think, will the antelope's mother grieve for her calf? So I can't promise to be able to answer most or even any of these questions, but what I will try to do in this talk is to first survey what kinds of responses have been recorded among non-human animals to dead individuals, and what these responses might tell us about the kind of underlying death-related concepts in these animals. And then at the end, I will also briefly consider grief specifically, as well as what implications a better understanding of these phenomena might have for animal welfare. So on this graphical summary, what I tried to do was to put together, to give you an idea basically of the orders of mammals, so the taxonomic orders of mammals from which we have published scientific reports on responses to death. And I think one of the things that quickly pops out is that these reports cover quite a broad taxonomic spread, although some orders are represented by just one or a few species. And that, of course, doesn't mean that mammals in other orders don't respond to the dead. It's just that we don't yet have good kind of published reports on them. So, for example, we don't really know a great deal about how bats or aardvarks or kangaroos respond to the dead, although for at least some of these kind of missing pieces, we do have some anecdotal evidence that exists. just not scientifically published yet. So we'll come back to this figure later when we look at what specific ways there are of animals' responses or animals' treatment of the dead. But first, what I want to do now is to quickly tell you about 3 chimpanzee case reports that we observed at our field research site, which is coordinated by Kyoto University, and which is located in BOSSOU in Guinea, West Africa. And they're each kind of incredibly striking cases, I think, things you see, once you see them, you don't easily forget them. All 3 cases involved young individuals, young infants, so Jokro, Jimato, and Veve, each of whom died of a suspected respiratory illness before they turned 3 years old. And these dead infants, they weren't abandoned by the mothers, but they continued to be carried and to be looked after, to be groomed and protected, much like live animals of this age would be by their mothers. And over the course of the carrying, all 3 infants mummified, and the length of the carrying was really extraordinary. So in the first case, carrying continued for more than 27 days, in the second case for 68 days, and then in the third case for 19 days. And it's extraordinary for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that this length of carrying, really amazing, because the infants had to be carried in ways that no live infant ever is, because they could no longer hold on to their mother, and they could no longer cling, so they really encumbered the mothers. They had to be carried in unusual ways. So for example, by grasping a limb between the neck and the shoulder, which is what you see in these images here when the mothers were walking, or by climbing and then, when climbing, holding the body between the thigh and the belly, the so-called thigh pocket in the chimpanzee, that's what you see in this image, or even by dangling just by the foot when resting in the trees. And the mothers also continued to groom the bodies, and they swatted flies from them. You're seeing that in that video. And the grooming in particular, I think you can interpret in different ways, I guess. So you could, for example, argue that these mothers don't know that their infants are dead, and they continue to treat them as live, or that they do know that the infants are not alive, but they choose to keep them clean anyway. And then group mates other than the mother also showed a lot of interest in the body, so we saw a number of different responses from these individuals. They ranged from investigatory behaviors like smelling and touching and inspecting, or lifting limbs and dropping them, to dragging and pulling and playing with the corpses, but also to caretaking and attendance. So this, for example, here is this dead infant's grandmother, who sat by the corpse while the mother was off feeding, and she groomed it and she swatted flies from it. And the mothers were generally quite tolerant to these behaviors, even if it meant relinquishing possession of the corpses temporarily. So you see this one particular mother here, and there's the corpse left behind. And this is a juvenile that comes in quite cautiously, picks up the corpse and carries it off. And you see the mother initially, she turns around, she sort of gets up as if she was making to go to get the corpse back, but eventually she just sort of lets the juvenile run off with it and play. And again, this is not too dissimilar to what a live infant of this age would be allowed to do. 2-year-olds do still travel with the mother at all times, but when the group is stationary, the mothers do allow these infants to wander off and play with others in the group. And then interestingly, or maybe importantly, we never saw any aggression being directed towards the corpses. Although in one case, this is the one case when an adult male used one of these bodies in a display during a fight. So this was at the point when the body had already completely mummified. But even here, I think this seemed like rather kind of gentle handling of the corpse. He's not tearing it to pieces, he's not sort of flinging it around, but actually sort of quite softly just pulls it along the ground and then gently switches hands when he turns around. And just lastly, I want to show a clip that illustrates a kind of combination of different responses. So here, first of all, we've got an infant playing with the corpse, and I think he's sort of veering between fear and curiosity, really, until it seems like curiosity gets the better of him. And so this is the dead infant's mother, and this is this infant's mother. And if you watch carefully, you'll see that live infant's mother is also peering at the body with curiosity. But then she, in a moment, she'll show what might be seen as a sort of aversion to the corpse. So watch this. So she doesn't really, she's happy for her infant to play with the corpse, but she really doesn't want to be touched by it. So, having said that, this was really the only time when we saw any individual respond in this way. So far I've talked about dead infant care in chimpanzees, but this is something that is seen very broadly among primates. We have examples, for example, from geladas, mountain gorillas, orangutans, lemurs, and some of it on a really huge scale. So Sugiyama and his colleagues, for example, documented over 150 cases of dead infant carrying over 24 years of observation on Japanese macaques. And in each case, really, the theme is the same. The mothers continue to show maternal behavior toward their dead infants. And furthermore, the behavior isn't restricted to primates. So other mammals have been seen to care for and to transport dead infants. So dolphins and whales, for example, carry dead calves. Dingoes and elephants stay with their deceased young. Or this giraffe here from Fred Berkovich's observations remains with and is sort of nudging her dead calf in this picture. So, and the behavior itself is generally explained in terms of the persistence of this extremely strong mother-infant bond in these species. It's particularly strong in mammals, where the mother really invests a huge amount into each of her offspring. And then if we also add in non-infant deaths, so older individuals, there too we have some of the same responses that we see for that we saw for infants, so caretaking, like grooming, then inspection and attendance by the body, but also things that indicate maybe more negative or sort of conflicted psychological states, such as alarm calling or aggression, and even cannibalism and sexual behavior in some cases. And I think there are some more kind of nuanced response classes as well, but the majority really do, the majority which are reported in this large collection of papers, which I'm going to make use of next, can be classed into one or other of these kind of broad categories. So then on the next slide, I'm going to try to show you graphically how these different responses are distributed among the mammalian orders and species that we saw at the beginning. So for example, in chimpanzees, other authors have reported aggression towards corpses, including those of infants, and even cannibalism. And then in other species as well, we see quite a sort of broad spectrum of responses from caretaking to sexual behavior. But I should say that, so some of these descriptions, I think, are more complete than others, and obviously for some orders we have information on the treatment only of dead infants, but not of dead adults, or vice versa. So I think this is maybe best seen as really just a snapshot of our current knowledge, very much just an emerging picture. But it does mean that, I think we can say that at least these responses are present in these different orders and species. So then the important question of what drives these different responses, what might determine when individuals respond with caretaking and when with aggression or alarm. And several people here have discussed interesting potential ideas. So for example, a death where the cause is clear, so let's say a predator attack, may lead to less, say, alarm calling than a case where the cause is unclear, so like an opaque illness, for example. Then state of decomposition, so how much like a live animal the corpse looks. It may be that less decomposed corpses elicit more kind of normal or stronger reactions. Then the deceased social status, so an alpha male, a dead alpha male would generate more interest than a more peripheral male, or an infant that's not yet fully socially integrated. Also the deceased social relationship to the individual. So a mother probably will respond differently to her own dead offspring than to an unrelated groupmate. Also, Christoph Bosch interestingly suggests that groups that live in high predation habitats have more frequent encounters with, and therefore a more kind of sophisticated knowledge of death. While in a sort of similar vein, Katie Cronin's team suggests that a chimpanzee mother with a dead infant is actively seeking sensory information on the corpse, which may inform her future behavior should another one of her infants die. So we might be seeing not only these kinds of proximate body cue and relationship quality effects, but also learning about death in determining what responses we see. But perhaps there's also a slightly different way of looking at this if we wanted to split things up by sort of underlying psychological states. So there are some reactions that might fall under sort of normal interactions, and those might suggest that there's a lack of understanding that the state of that individual has changed. Although I think even that's not entirely clear in all cases. But at some point, we begin to see behaviors that suggest that such a recognition has indeed taken place. And I think stemming from this recognition, we may find things like curiosity, curious exploration of the body, and we may find fear, so fearful responses like alarm calling. But essentially, I think that what we might be seeing is that at the intersection of these things is a recognition by the individual that something's not right. So even though this corpse may look normal, it doesn't act normal. When I try to play with it, it doesn't join in. When I hit it, it doesn't respond. So in a way, the corpse violates expectations, as Andre Gonçalves calls it, to which you might respond with curiosity or fear, or some combination of these two. But if that is the case, then this can in turn tell us about what those expectations are that non-human animals have. And that comes back to those questions that I raised at the very beginning for the baboon. Do they know the difference between animate and inanimate things? What cues do they use to tell the difference between things that are alive and things that aren't alive, and so on? And of course, these are some of the exact same questions that developmental psychologists are asking in studying children's understanding of animacy and death. And it also links to the motivation behind comparative thanatology, this recently emerged field that seeks evolutionary roots to death-related behavioral and psychological phenomena. So the idea is that by using information from species that are both closely and distantly related to humans, we can gain insight into the evolutionary origins of our own responses to the dead. So, and then returning to grief, although I think the adaptive value of grief is unclear to us. In other words, it's not entirely clear what the function of grief is. It could be a signal to attract support from others, or simply it could be just a byproduct of the processes that maintain those strong social bonds in the first place, and they linger even once that individual has passed away, one of the individuals has passed away. But having said that, there are among non-humans, quantifiable behavioral and hormonal responses that accompany the loss of an individual with a close social bond. So we see loss of appetite, loss of sleep, withdrawal from the social group, things like lethargy, and even elevated stress hormones. And so given all of this, I think I agree with Barbara King's perspective here that it's possible to decouple grief from the awareness of death. So you don't have to know what death is in order to be able to grieve. And then finally, that brings us to this last point, which is that managing grief is something that we perhaps ought to bear in mind explicitly when devising management plans for dying zoo individuals or even pets. So in zoos, dying animals are often separated from their normal social groups, and pets that are about to be euthanized are also often separated from their companions. But this can lead to extended periods of searching and distress in those companions that get left behind. So alternatives to these practices might be seen as more humane. So this here is the chimpanzee Pansy, who was allowed to die in the company of her social group at a Scottish zoo. And Jim Anderson and colleagues who've studied that particular case argue that this allowed those others in the group that remained behind to gain a sense of the fact that Pansy wasn't coming back. So if we consider the welfare of the animals that stay behind, then I think it may be better to allow death not to happen kind of removed in space and out of sight, but actually in the presence of the others with whom that individual shares a close social bond. And that might prevent extended distress in these close affiliates and also allow animals to learn about the dying process and about the finality of death. Thank you very much.